Some events in life are so unexpected that they leave a mark that erases everything that came before. That was the case the day Steve, my husband's son from his first marriage, unexpectedly came into my room. Up to that point, everything had been routine. My husband, Daddy, was at work as usual, and I was getting ready for a fundraiser. Steve, who had only recently returned home after a difficult period, was spending time with us to recuperate. We hardly ever crossed paths. His silent presence in the house seemed to shield us from having to build a connection. But that night, everything changed. I stood in front of the mirror trying on my dress for the event. Red and tight, it emphasized my figure, but it felt too provocative. I tossed it off and stayed in my underwear, looking for something more appropriate. My gaze settled on a simple but elegant black dress hanging in my closet. Pulling it out, I crouched down to remove the stockings. The material slid gently down my legs, leaving my skin exposed. At that moment, the door swung open. "Ellen, are you here?" Steve's voice sounded, but his phrase was cut short. When he saw me, I froze. His gaze rose slowly from the floor to my face, stopping at my exposed shoulders. Steve's cheeks instantly flushed, and he turned away abruptly. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, stumbling and nearly hitting the lamp. The door slammed shut, leaving me alone with an unbearable mixture of embarrassment and anxiety. My heart was beating so loudly that it seemed to be audible outside the room. Everything that had just happened had left an imprint on me. I felt vulnerable, but at the same time, something about this moment felt different, frighteningly new. That incident with Steve never left my mind. At dinner, when Eddie had talked about his plans for the next week, I'd nodded, but inside I'd been seething. Steve was quiet, barely lifting his eyes from his plate. His demeanor had begun to change since that day. Instead of his previous aloofness, he was suddenly lingering in the kitchen when I was cooking, or sitting in the living room, silently watching me. There was a depth to his gaze that was both frightening and appealing. One evening when Eddie was working late, Steve came into the living room where I was reading a book. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Ellen, can I ask you something?" I pulled away from the book and looked at him. He was standing by the door, illuminated by the soft light of the desk lamp. His eyes, darkened, full of emotion, pierced me. "Of course," I replied, trying to sound calm. "Do you ever feel like you're out of place? That everything you do isn't what you were meant to do?" His words sounded unexpectedly honest. I was confused, not knowing what to say. His candle was both disarming and frightening. I tried to find some clue in his gaze, but he just waited. He didn't answer immediately, but stepped closer, his tall figure filling the space between us. The silence was deafening until he continued. "Ever since I came back here, I felt only one thing. You're the only person who makes me feel alive." His words hit me like thunder. I stood up, trying to keep my distance, but he stopped me with a light touch on my arm. His fingers were warm, almost scalding. "Steve, this isn't right," I said, but my voice betrayed me by shaking. His confession hung in the air. I should have walked away, told him it was impossible. But instead, I stayed. We were so close I could feel his breath. He lifted his hand and gently touched my face, his gaze asking for permission. I don't know how much time passed before his lips were on mine. It was a quiet, soft kiss, full of restrained emotion. It was as if the world around us stopped, leaving only the two of us in this moment. The silence was crushing, spreading like an invisible blanket across the room. After our hands had accidentally touched, I stared at the TV screen, but the story flashed before my eyes in a kaleidoscope of meaninglessness. All my concentration was focused on not giving away the shiver that had settled in my chest. Steve sat silent too, his gaze not fixed on the screen. I could feel him unmoving, thinking about something. The tension was almost unbearable, but I couldn't get up, couldn't leave. Something in me demanded that I stay and wait, to see where this moment would lead. The minutes stretched into eternity. I noticed his breathing was slower, deeper. He tried to play it casual, crossed his legs, then uncrossed them as if he didn't know where to put himself. His hand rested on the armrest close to mine. I stood up. The move was both an attempt to escape and a desperate attempt to realize what was happening. But just as I turned to leave, Steve stood up as well, his figure obscured by the faint light from the TV. "Wait," he said quietly. The words stopped me. His voice was soft, almost pleading, and I couldn't keep going. I struggled to turn around, but when our gazes met, I realized I couldn't fight the tension anymore. It had taken hold of both of us. He stepped closer, his face so close I could feel the warmth of his breath. The room became unbearably stuffy, as if the walls had shrunk, leaving just the two of us. I've been thinking about how to say this for a long time. He spoke slowly as if he was struggling with each word. But I think we both know I wanted to object. But the words stuck in my throat. His eyes studied my face, my every breath betraying confusion. At that moment, I realized I couldn't look away, as if some invisible force was drawing me in. Suddenly, he leaned in so close that my hair lightly brushed his chin. I couldn't resist anymore. Not my emotions, not this moment. When his lips touched mine, it was as if the world stopped. The kiss was both timid and insistent, full of the emotions we'd both been hiding for so long. I recoiled, but I couldn't pull away completely. For a brief moment, I met his gaze full of remorse and desire. "It's wrong," I finally blurted out. But my words sounded unconvincing, like I was trying to reassure myself. He didn't answer, only stepped back, giving me space. His silence said more than any words could. I almost ran out of the room, shutting myself in. My heart was pounding so loud, I was sure the whole house could hear the noise. I spent the rest of the night worrying, trying to figure out what had just happened. The boundary that had existed between us had been erased in an instant, and then there was no turning back. In the morning, when I went down to the kitchen, he was already there. His apparent attempts at normal behavior only made things worse. Our eyes met, and I realized this wasn't over. I saw him in the morning light, standing in the kitchen like a ghost of my own fears. His face was pale, his features gaunt, and his fingers trembled as he clutched the phone in his hand. I froze involuntarily on the threshold, feeling the silence of the room literally pressing against my chest. Something had changed. We both knew it, but neither of us dared to. Other words that might break the fragile balance between us. He turned to me, his gaze frozen for a moment, as if he were trying to decide whether or not to say what was on his mind. I felt something heavy in the air, unspoken. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse-broken. "I have to leave soon." The words echoed inside me with a strange emptiness, as if someone had knocked the ground out from under my feet. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I stayed calm, trying to hide the emotions that seemed about to erupt. "Why?" I asked, knowing his answer would change everything. "It's hard to explain." He turned away, resting his hands on the kitchen counter. "Just trust me, it's for the best." Better for who? The question was on my tongue, but I couldn't say it. Suddenly, it was hard to breathe. The shattering silence between us became an invisible chasm. I clenched my fingers into fists to keep myself from rushing over to him. and forcing him to explain. Instead, I turned and left the room, feeling the tears stinging my eyes. Later that day, I found him in the garden. He was standing, with his arms wrapped around one of the wooden pergola supports, looking as if this corner of the house was his only refuge. I knew I had to be honest, even though a voice inside me was screaming, "Don't leave it as it is." But I couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Are you really going to leave?" I asked, stopping a few steps away from him. He turned slowly. His eyes met mine, and I saw pain there. Real deep pain. "Yes," he finally answered. "I can't stay here anymore." "Is it because of me?" My voice was quieter than I'd expected. His silence said more than any words could. Steve took a step toward me, his hand reaching out faintly but dropping as if he changed his mind. I felt a deafening pain building in my chest. Why couldn't he just tell me what was really going on? "It's too complicated," he added. "I don't want to hurt you." This night was particularly dark. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and a strange gloom enveloped the whole house. I couldn't sleep, thoughts of his departure drilling into my brain. I felt like I was losing a part of myself with every step he took, and the feeling was unbearable. When I heard the stairs creak, I knew it was him. I left my room and found him in the living room. He was standing by the window, staring out into the emptiness of the night, as if searching for answers. I stepped closer and he turned his head, noticing me. We didn't say a word. I felt something break inside me, as if the invisible barriers we both worked so hard to build had shattered. Steve stepped closer to me, his hand lightly touching mine. The touch was an electric shock, a reminder that there was still more between us than we were willing to admit. His gaze was intense, but there was so much desire and regret in it at the same time that it took my breath away. "I can't leave you," he finally exhaled. The words were the confession I've been waiting for, but I didn't know if I was ready to hear them. His face was so close, and in that moment, I realized that all our restrained feelings, inhibitions, and doubts were nothing compared to what we had in common. There was only a thin line between us that we both knew we were about to cross. His hands found mine, and that moment was the culmination of the tension that had been building between us for days. Everything else, words, doubts, even the house itself, had ceased to exist. Only we absorbed in that moment remained real. The next morning, everything looked different. The sun's rays through the curtains seemed to purify the air. He was still on the verge of deciding to leave, but now there was no secret tension between us. It was a time of clarity, but also a time of decisions. I knew he would leave, but now I was sure it wasn't the end. It was only the first step in the story we would have to write together.